Sometimes the heart writes its own curriculum, teaching us that love doesn't follow the rules we think we understand, and the most profound lessons come from the courage to feel without limits. Professor Laura Mendoza stood at the podium of Lecture Hall 203, her voice carrying the measured confidence of someone who had spent 23 years teaching literature to eager young minds. At 45, she commanded respect in the academic world. Published author, department head, the kind of professor whose classes filled up within minutes of registration opening. Her students saw her as brilliant and untouchable, a woman who lived entirely in the realm of ideas and scholarly achievement. But none of them knew that behind her professional composure, Laura was rebuilding herself from the ground up. 6 months ago, her 20-year marriage had ended not with dramatic confrontation, but with the quiet recognition that she and her husband had become strangers sharing a house. The divorce papers had been signed with the same detached efficiency she brought to grading papers. Necessary, civilized, and utterly devastating. Laura had thrown herself into her work with renewed intensity, accepting every conference invitation, every guest lecture opportunity, every committee assignment that came her way. If she stayed busy enough, focused enough, professional enough, maybe she could forget that she felt more alone at 45 than she had at 25. That Tuesday morning, as she discussed the themes of forbidden love in classical literature, Laura noticed him in the third row. A student she hadn't seen before, with dark hair that caught the light and eyes that seemed to be listening not just to her words, but to the spaces between them. When she asked the class to analyze the role of age in romantic literature, his hand shot up immediately. "Professor Mendoza," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent that suggested Brazilian roots, "don't you think literature sometimes uses age differences to explore deeper questions about experience versus passion? Like, maybe the real conflict isn't about numbers, but about different ways of understanding what love means?" Laura paused, struck not just by the insight, but by the way he seemed to be looking directly into her soul while discussing academic theory. Diego Santos was 23 years old and felt like he was on fire with possibility. As a senior literature major, he had discovered that words could capture every shade of human emotion, that poetry could make the invisible visible, that stories could change the way people saw the world. He wrote constantly, in notebooks during lectures, on napkins in coffee shops, in the notes app of his phone when inspiration struck at midnight. He had grown up in São Paulo until age 15, when his family moved to the United States for his father's work. The transition had taught him to see life as an adventure rather than a plan, to embrace change rather than fear it. While his classmates worried about career trajectories and 5-year plans, Diego believed that following your heart was the only strategy that mattered. When he walked into Professor Mendoza's advanced contemporary literature class, Diego had expected another semester of analyzing texts and writing papers. He hadn't expected to be captivated by the professor herself, not just her obvious intelligence and expertise, but something deeper. There was a sadness in her eyes that contradicted her confident demeanor, a loneliness that made him want to write poems about the complexity of human hearts. If stories of love that challenges expectations and teaches us that the heart recognizes no boundaries speak to your soul, subscribe to the Untold Love Stories and join us in exploring the courage it takes to love without limits. After class, Diego lingered, pretending to organize his notes while the other students filed out. When the lecture hall was empty, except for the two of them, he approached Laura's desk with the nervous energy of someone about to take a significant risk. "Professor Mendoza, I was wondering if you'd be willing to look at some of my poetry. I know it's not officially part of the curriculum, but I'd value your feedback." Laura looked up from her papers, noting the earnestness in Diego's expression. She had been teaching long enough to recognize genuine passion for literature, and despite the inappropriateness of personal attention to any one student, something about Diego's request felt different. "I suppose I could take a look," she said carefully. Why don't you email me a few pieces and I'll provide some notes? That evening, Laura opened Diego's submission with the clinical detachment she brought to all student work. But as she read his poems, raw, honest pieces about love and loss and the immigrant experience, she found herself moved in ways she hadn't expected. His writing had a maturity that surprised her, an understanding of emotional complexity that seemed far beyond his 23 years. "Your imagery is powerful," she wrote in her response email, "and your grasp of metaphor shows real sophistication. But I'm curious about the recurring theme of hidden connections, of love that exists in the spaces where society doesn't expect it. These pieces feel deeply personal. Are you drawing from experience or exploring theoretical emotional territory?" She hesitated before hitting send, wondering if the question was too personal for a professor-student exchange. Diego's response came within an hour. "Professor Mendoza, I think the best poetry always comes from some truth, even if it's truth we're still figuring out. The themes you noticed, they're about believing that connection can happen anywhere, between anyone, regardless of what the world thinks makes sense. I write about hidden love because I think most real love is hidden at first, waiting for the courage to become visible." Over the next few weeks, their email correspondence evolved from academic feedback into something more complex. Laura found herself looking forward to Diego's thoughtful responses, his unique perspectives on literature, his ability to find beauty in unexpected places. Diego, meanwhile, was falling in love not just with Laura's brilliant mind, but with the glimpses of vulnerability she occasionally let slip through her professional armor. "I keep thinking about what you said regarding Neruda's love poetry," Diego wrote after a particularly intense class discussion. "You mentioned that some love feels impossible not because it's wrong, but because it asks us to be braver than we think we can be. That resonated with me more than you might expect. Sometimes I wonder if we limit ourselves not because of real obstacles, but because we're afraid of what others might think about our happiness." The shift from professional correspondence to personal connection happened gradually, then all at once. When Diego suggested meeting for coffee to discuss his senior thesis proposal, Laura agreed, telling herself it was purely academic mentorship. But when they sat across from each other in the small cafe near campus, surrounded by the comfortable buzz of other conversations, something changed in the space between them. "Tell me about your thesis topic," Laura said, wrapping her hands around her coffee cup and trying to maintain appropriate professor-student boundaries. Diego leaned forward, his eyes bright with enthusiasm. "I want to write about love poetry as social rebellion, how poets throughout history have used romantic verse to challenge societal expectations and power structures. Basically, how love poems can be revolutionary acts." Laura felt a flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with caffeine. "That's a fascinating angle. You're suggesting that by writing about forbidden or unexpected love, poets weren't just expressing personal feelings. They were making political statements?" Diego nodded eagerly. "Exactly. When someone writes honestly about loving someone they're not supposed to love, they're questioning who gets to decide what's acceptable. They're claiming their right to feel everything, regardless of social rules." Their conversation continued for 2 hours, ranging from academic theory to personal philosophy, from literature to life experiences. Laura found herself sharing stories about her own writing, her struggles with creativity after her divorce, her fear that she had become too cautious to take any real risks. Diego listened with an intensity that made her feel truly heard for the first time in years. "Can I tell you something?" Diego said as they prepared to leave. "Your classes have changed how I think about everything. Not just literature, but life. You have this way of finding meaning in complexity, of showing how beautiful things can exist inside difficult circumstances. I think you're an incredible teacher, but more than that, I think you're an incredible person." Laura felt heat rise in her cheeks, a combination of pleasure and alarm at the personal nature of his compliment. Walking back to campus together, they fell into step naturally, their conversation continuing with the ease of old friends rather than professor and student. When they reached the point where their paths diverged, Diego hesitated. "Professor Mendoza, Laura, would you maybe want to do this again? Just talk, I mean. I feel like I learn more in an hour of conversation with you than in weeks of regular classes." Laura knew she should say no, should maintain professional boundaries, should remember the 22 years between them and the power dynamics at play. But looking at Diego's hopeful expression, she found herself nodding. "I'd like that," she admitted, immediately questioning her judgment, but unable to deny that she had felt more alive during their conversation than she had in months. Over the following weeks, their coffee meetings became a regular occurrence, carefully scheduled during Laura's office hours when their interactions could be explained as extended academic mentoring. But both of them knew they had crossed into territory that had nothing to do with thesis supervision and everything to do with a connection neither had expected, but both craved. "I've been thinking about what you said regarding emotional honesty in writing," Laura said during one of their meetings. "You mentioned that the best poetry comes from truth we're still figuring out. I think I've spent so many years being careful, being appropriate, being what everyone expects a professor to be, that I've forgotten how to access that kind of raw honesty." Diego studied her face intently. Maybe the solution isn't accessing it. Maybe it's allowing it. The tension between them was becoming harder to ignore. Laura caught herself looking forward to their meetings with an anticipation that felt dangerous, while Diego was writing poetry inspired by every conversation they shared. When he submitted his latest piece for her review, a poem about the space between words, about connections that exist beyond language, Laura realized he was writing about her. "Diego," she said at their next meeting, her voice careful and measured, "we need to talk about boundaries. I'm your professor, you're my student, and regardless of what we might feel personally, there are professional ethics to consider. Not to mention the fact that you're 23 and I'm 45. This age difference isn't just a number. It represents completely different life stages, different levels of experience, different expectations for the future." Diego set down his coffee cup and looked directly at her. "Laura, with all respect, I think you're using professional ethics and age as excuses to avoid dealing with something that scares you. Yes, you're my professor, but you're also a brilliant, beautiful, complex woman who makes me want to be a better writer and a better person. Yes, I'm 23, but I'm not some naive kid looking for an adventure. I'm a man who recognizes something extraordinary when he finds it. But what happens when the semester ends?" Laura asked, her voice betraying the vulnerability she was trying to hide. "What happens when you graduate and move on to whatever comes next in your life? What happens when you realize that being involved with your former professor was just a phase, an interesting story to tell about your college years?" Diego reached across the table and gently touched her hand. "What happens if we're both so afraid of getting hurt that we throw away something real because it doesn't fit other people's expectations?" Laura pulled her hand away, not because she didn't want his touch, but because she wanted it too much. "Diego, I can't risk my career, my reputation, everything I've built for something that might not last. I went through a devastating divorce 6 months ago. I'm still figuring out who I am as a single woman. The last thing I need is to complicate my life with a relationship that everyone will judge and nobody will understand." "I'm not asking you to risk anything right now," Diego said softly. "I'm just asking you not to close the door on possibility. We don't have to figure everything out today. We don't have to announce anything to anyone. But we also don't have to pretend that what we feel isn't real just because it's complicated." Laura looked into his eyes and saw not the impulsive passion she expected from someone his age, but something deeper. Patience, understanding, and a maturity that challenged all her assumptions about what 23 was supposed to look like. As the semester progressed, Laura and Diego found themselves navigating an increasingly complex emotional landscape. Their coffee meetings continued, but now carried the weight of acknowledged attraction and unresolved tension. Laura was torn between her growing feelings and her practical concerns, while Diego was learning that loving someone meant respecting their fears even when you didn't share them. The crisis came during a department conference in Chicago, where Laura was presenting a paper on contemporary Latin American literature. Diego, as one of the top students in the program, had been selected to attend as a research assistant. Finding themselves in the same hotel, in the same city, away from campus politics and watching eyes, the pretense of purely professional interaction became impossible to maintain. "Laura," Diego said as they walked along the Chicago River after the day's sessions had ended, "I need you to know something. These feelings I have for you, they're not going away. I've tried to be patient, tried to respect your boundaries, tried to convince myself that this is just admiration for a professor. But it's more than that, and I think you know it." Laura stopped walking, her heart racing as she realized they had reached the moment she had been both dreading and anticipating. "Diego, she began, then stopped, looking out at the water reflecting the city lights. "I feel it too. That's what terrifies me. I feel more connected to you than I felt to my husband in the last 5 years of my marriage. I look forward to our conversations more than anything else in my week. When you smile at something I've said, it lights up my entire day. But feeling this way about a student, about someone so much younger, it goes against everything I thought I knew about myself." They found themselves in Laura's hotel room, not with any predetermined intention, but because continuing their conversation in the lobby felt too public, too exposed. Sitting on opposite ends of the small couch, they talked until nearly dawn, about their fears, their hopes, the impossibility of their situation, and the undeniable reality of their connection. When Diego finally kissed her, it was with a tenderness that acknowledged how precious and fragile this moment was. "I don't know what happens next," Laura whispered against his lips. "I don't know how to navigate this or what it means or whether it's a terrible mistake that will destroy everything I've worked for." Diego cupped her face in his hands, looking at her with an expression of complete certainty. "We don't have to know what happens next. We just have to be brave enough to find out." They spent the night together, not just physically but emotionally, sharing stories and fears and dreams with the intimacy of people who had found something rare and unexpected. When morning came, Laura felt transformed, not just by physical intimacy, but by the experience of being truly seen and accepted by someone who loved her, not despite her complications, but because of them. But returning to campus meant returning to reality. Laura immediately retreated into professional distance, terrified that their night together had been visible somehow, that everyone would know, that her carefully constructed career would crumble around her. Diego, hurt but understanding, gave her space while making it clear that his feelings hadn't changed. The semester ended with both of them knowing they had crossed a line they couldn't uncross, but uncertain about what came next. Summer break provided both relief and agony for Laura and Diego. Without the excuse of academic interaction, they had no natural reason to see each other, but the feelings that had developed between them didn't diminish with distance. Laura spent the summer accepting a teaching position at a writer's retreat in Vermont, hoping that physical distance would provide emotional clarity. Diego remained in town, working at a local bookstore and pouring his feelings into poetry. When classes resumed in the fall, Diego was no longer Laura's student. He had graduated and was working on graduate school applications, while supporting himself through various writing projects. The change in their academic relationship should have made things easier, but Laura found new reasons to maintain distance. Now it wasn't just about professional ethics, but about her fear that her divorce had left her too damaged for any real relationship, especially with someone who deserved better than a complicated middle-aged woman. Diego, meanwhile, was learning that loving someone meant more than wanting to be with them. It meant wanting their happiness, even when they couldn't see it themselves. He watched Laura throw herself into her work with an intensity that seemed designed to leave no room for personal relationships. He wrote her letters he never sent, drafted emails he never had the courage to deliver, and slowly began working on a project that would either bring them together or finally give him closure. 3 months after graduation, Diego's first book of poetry was published by a small but respected press. Lessons of the Heart was a collection of pieces exploring love in its many forms. The love between teacher and student that transcends classroom boundaries, the love that challenges social expectations, the love that requires courage to acknowledge and wisdom to pursue. The dedication page read simply, "For LM, who taught me that the best lessons are learned with an open heart." Laura discovered the book when a colleague mentioned seeing it in a local bookstore, noting that one of her former students had dedicated it to someone with her initials. Reading Diego's poetry, Laura realized that he had transformed their shared experience into something beautiful and honest. Not exploitative or sensational, but deeply respectful and genuinely moving. His poems captured not just his feelings for her, but his understanding of her fears, her complexity, her worth. The book launch was held at the same cafe where they had shared so many conversations. Laura stood in the back of the crowded room, listening to Diego read poems that she knew were about her, about them, about the love they had been too afraid to fully embrace. When he finished and people began approaching him to sign copies, his eyes found hers across the room with an expression of hope mixed with uncertainty. After the crowd dispersed, Laura approached Diego with a copy of his book in her hands. "You dedicated this to me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You made our story public. You risked everything to tell the truth about how you feel." Diego nodded, his heart pounding. "I realized that hiding how I feel about you wasn't protecting either of us. It was just keeping us both from living honestly. You taught me that literature is about finding courage to tell difficult truths. This is mine." 6 months later, Laura and Diego's relationship had evolved into something neither had expected, but both treasured. They had learned to navigate the reactions of others, some supportive, some disapproving, most eventually accepting that their connection was genuine rather than scandalous. Laura had discovered that Diego's youth brought not immaturity to their relationship, but energy, optimism, and a willingness to take emotional risks that had reawakened parts of herself she thought she'd lost. Diego, meanwhile, had learned that loving Laura meant embracing complexity, that real relationships required not just passion, but patience, understanding, and the maturity to support someone through their fears and insecurities. Their age difference, which had once seemed like an insurmountable obstacle, had become one of their strengths. Laura brought wisdom and stability, while Diego brought fresh perspective and fearless emotional honesty. They faced challenges, of course. Some colleagues questioned Laura's judgment. Some of Diego's friends couldn't understand his choice to be with an older woman, and both struggled occasionally with concerns about their different life stages. But they had also discovered something rare. A connection based on genuine respect, intellectual compatibility, and the kind of love that made them both want to be better versions of themselves. On a crisp autumn evening, they sat in their favorite cafe, Diego working on his second collection of poetry, while Laura graded papers. The domestic scene was comfortable and natural, two people who had found in each other not just romance, but partnership. "Do you ever regret it?" Laura asked quietly. "Taking such a public risk for us? Making your feelings so visible when you couldn't know how I'd respond?" Diego looked up from his notebook, reaching across the table to take her hand. "Laura, loving you taught me that the biggest risk isn't putting your heart on the line. It's keeping it safely hidden and missing the chance for something extraordinary. Yes, it was scary to publish those poems, to make my feelings public. But it was scarier to think about living my whole life wondering, what if? Sometimes the heart writes its own curriculum, teaching us that love doesn't follow the rules we think we understand, and the most profound lessons come from the courage to feel without limits." Laura and Diego had learned that age might mark the passage of time, but it couldn't limit the intensity of connection between two souls who recognized each other across all the arbitrary boundaries society creates. If this story touched your heart the same way it touched ours in telling it, leave a like so we can continue bringing these narratives that celebrate love in all its unexpected forms, and the courage to follow your heart regardless of what others might think. Subscribe to the Untold Love Stories and ring the bell, because every week we share new stories of souls who prove that real love doesn't ask permission from society's expectations, but writes its own rules based on authenticity and courage. In the comments, tell us, do you believe that genuine connection can transcend age, social expectations, and conventional relationship rules? Your stories inspire us to create even more touching narratives. Until the next episode, remember, the heart recognizes no boundaries except the ones we create for ourselves. And sometimes the most profound love stories are the ones that teach us to be braver than we ever thought possible.